Good morning, all. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the wonderful introductions. Let me just point out to John first, though, that I too lost the Tea Party because I was a Canadian at that time. I was born and brought up in Montreal and went to the United States to attend graduate school and just never came back. So it's really a great pleasure to be here for many reasons, and to be speaking at the Gerontology Research Center. And what I've taken sort of as my task this morning, and I apologize in advance if the perspective may be a little Americocentric. We tend to see the world only from the United States south of the 42nd parallel, and we think the rest of the world somehow spins on our axis. But in fact, a lot of what's going on, both in Canada and the United States, as concerns the right to die, is very closely tied to American politics and to American legal jurisprudence. So let's see if the old thing works here. Could we perhaps dim the lights just a phase? Or can you all see very well back out there? Well, there's probably enough light we can turn them all off. Then you can nap while I'm talking. Anyway, I was charged with telling you about the right to a compassionate choice at life's end. This is who I am in real life. This is supposedly what I do for profit. Compassion and Choices is an organization that came out of the merger of Compassion and Dying of Oregon and End of Life Choices, which was formerly the Hemlock Society. And we'll review that as we go along. I was for a while the chairman of the board of End of Life Choices, and now with the new board of directors, I'm the chairman of the Legislative Advocacy Committee. Why me? Well, I got interested in this, as Sue was saying, because of my father's own death, and unfortunately, Canada gets the blame for this too, because he died in a Veterans Administration hospital outside of Montreal. But what I learned was that there had to be a better way to die. When I then very nearly came close to dying myself, because when I fell off the horse, I ended up in a coma for 10 days. And was significantly brain injured at the same time as I received a spinal cord injury. And it was as a result of that, when I finally came to my senses, I realized that I didn't have an advance directive. I had no final instructions. And while this is something that people tend to worry about as they get older, let me tell you all, your life can change in an instant. Anyone in this room who does not have an advance directive, it's the first thing you're going to do tomorrow morning. Make out your living will. Because you never know. You might step off the curb and get hit by a car. I know, only too well. A friend of mine asked me if I would speak at a meeting because there was some controversy from the disability community about this question of end-of-life choice and physician-assisted dying. You will hear me try not to use the word suicide. This is a politically correct, PC is everything now, politically correct choice, because the word suicide, first of all, is not appropriate to what we're talking about. Suicide is a desperate act taken by people who are psychologically disturbed or depressed or in some way not right in their right mind and doing something desperate. What we're going to be talking about through most of this conference, and certainly in my talk, is about physician aid in dying. What we're doing is we're not taking someone's life. We're going to stop postponing their death. Their death is being postponed, and we're going to help them reach their end. So I became involved with the organization, and next thing I knew, as nonprofits really do mean nonprofit, it started using more and more of my time. We went through quite a period of time where we realized we had to change our name, because when you went to Washington and said, I'm from the Hemlock Society, they thought you were either a tree group or they weren't going to let people who had poison in their pocket come into their office. So our first step was, how do we figure out what we're going to call the organization? And I sat around with the staff, and we decided on the name End-of-Life Choices of America. The board of directors then decided we had to do proper research and conduct focus groups, and $100,000 later, we came out with the name End-of-Life Choices without America at the end. That wasn't very judicious, but you have to do what's called your due diligence. Then over the course of time, really 2 years or so, because we were now more correct in our name and because we were involved in doing more political and legal advocacy, the organization Compassion in Dying, which had basically split off from Hemlock originally back in '93, approached us about reunifying. And in fact, Compassion in Dying brought to the table many of the things that we had not been focusing on very effectively. And we, on the other side, brought to the table membership. We had over 30,000 members at that time and have close to 50,000 now, spread across all 50 United States. So recently, as a board, we came to what is going to be, or what we feel is supposed to be the mission statement or the guiding principle of Compassion and Choices. And this is the culmination of our thinking. It's not very complicated. We seek a society where people receive state-of-the-art care at the end of life. That means the best hospice care, the best pain care, that they don't have to make a choice to end their life if they don't want to, but they have a full range of choices for dying in comfort, dignity, and control. We see as our mission to support, educate, and advocate for choice and care at the end of life. It all seems a little redundant, but we like to try and tell ourselves the same things many times. Maybe we'll get it right. As we do it, we try to maintain integrity, respect, do the best we can, and we try to collaborate with other groups. There is, in case you don't know, an entire World Right to Die Society, World Euthanasia Group, that counts members in many countries with various laws. And in fact, for example, Japan has the largest Right to Die Society in the world. Enormous, big budget. They're just now getting to the point in Japanese society where advanced directives are being accepted, that they're beginning to have advanced directives. And of course, the confusion, the problem in Japanese society is because to end your own life is an act of dishonor with harikari. So to choose to end your own life because of sickness or suffering comes into conflict with the cultural context there. So how are we going to achieve our mission? Well, we provide client information and support for choice, including hastened death, to mentally competent, terminally ill adults. That's a very important definition for us, and it's a very important definition for anyone who's going to work in this area of physician aid in dying, because you will find that there are many people who wish to end their life prematurely. They may have a good reason. They may have terrible suffering. But unless you can qualify that they know why and what they're doing and that they are facing a terminal illness, you as an organization are put in an awkward position if you begin to provide services to them, because you begin to run into social convention. And in the United States, this is much more acute than in Canada, because we have a very pronounced right-wing, religious, fundamentalist segment of the population. In fact, it turned out to be much larger than we thought. They elected George Bush on us when we weren't looking. So we try to limit our definition to mentally competent, terminally ill adults. But terminally ill is defined as having 6 months left to live. If you can show me a physician who can guarantee to me that I have more than 6 months to live, he can make the definition for me of telling me I have less than 6 months to live. So it's a flexible definition. It's still one that we can work with. We educate people. We've tried to provide information to the general public, to healthcare and legal professionals, and to lawmakers and the media. And in fact, I'm going to be on one of your local programs tomorrow to talk about, in fact, the conference. And we chose to get involved with advocacy to both pass legislation and pursue litigation that improves end-of-life care and gives us that choice that we all want. Now, of course, being a scientist, I know that whenever discussing anything of this nature, one has to go back to ancient Greece, because, the Greeks knew it all, and we're just trying to figure it out now. And in fact, this man is responsible for the name of the organization I first joined, the Hemlock Organization, Socrates. And those little things you see at the bottom are vials of hemlock that were used to execute the condemned in Greece. No electric chair or dragging people behind chariots. They asked people, or basically forced people, to take poison. Socrates was sentenced to death in 399 BC, so we only have a few thousand years to cover in the next 15 minutes. Socrates is said, however, to have accepted the verdict, and rather than being forced to drink the poison, he decided he wanted to have it at the time that he chose. So he gathered all his friends, had a party, and drank the hemlock at the time of his choosing. That's in fact exactly what we see in our client support services. You have people in the Right to Die Network of Canada who are involved with providing that kind of client support to people who are dying. And we see that people rejoice in their death instead of fearing it. There are certain universal truths: taxes, aging, death. We all share them. This is your brain. This is the effect of aging on your brain. Any questions? The neuroscientist in me just can't resist this one. But that brings us to the point that the miracle of modern medicine has given us what we might call a new living grave. Because since the artificial resuscitator was invented back in the 70s, and we could keep people alive who were brain dead, we changed the playing field. We changed the playing field dramatically. And we've certainly seen cases recently where that's the case. People always tell me that, it's not God's will what you're doing. You're interfering with God's will. Well, we interfered with God's will when we figured out how to keep people alive when nature dictated that it was their time to go. This is perhaps one of the best quotes, looking at this from a religious perspective, that we've had the honor to hear at one of our meetings. It was delivered by John Shelby Spong, who's the Episcopal Bishop of Newark. And he stated that he believed that when a person arrives at that point, when death has become a kinder alternative than hopeless pain, and when chronic dependency on narcotics begins to require the loss of personal dignity, then the basic human right to choose how and when to die should be guaranteed by law and respected by our communities of faith. And that was presented at our meeting in San Diego, California, not so long ago, in January of 2003. And one of the big things that's happening in the quote-unquote right to die movement is our ability to incorporate voices of faith, the voice of people from different churches. And we have found in polling that we've done nationally, and we'll talk about some in a second, that in fact in all religious groups, people favor choice in dying. They favor the right to die. It breaks down slightly differently by religious background. The Jewish faith, 90%, right up there at the top. But even Catholics come in the 60 to 70% range when they believe there are adequate safeguards. So the Hemlock Board decided to choose a path to pursue legal advocacy. Hemlock was not involved with this in any real way prior, but we decided as a board that we needed to pursue this. So how do we pursue the right to a compassionate choice? Well, there are social, legal, and legislative factors that have formed the history of this movement. And let me just zip through a little bit what some of the hallmarks or the highlights are in each of these areas. Some of the social highlights, well, in 1906, the first euthanasia bill actually was drafted in Ohio. Didn't pass. In 1935, the first euthanasia society was founded in London, England. In 1938, the Euthanasia Society of America was founded by Reverend Charles Potter in New York, and his founding board members, I met one of their daughters in New York City at a meeting we held there recently to celebrate the merger of compassion in dying and end-of-life choices. And so we're latecomers to this game, folks. I hate to tell you, but they've been at it for 70 years. In 1954, Joseph Fletcher published a book that predicted that there would be a coming controversy over the right to die. He had a good crystal ball. In 1969, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who we probably all know, published On Death and Dying, and that awakened widespread public discussion about the question that we all do, which is dying. In 1974, the American Euthanasia Society was renamed because euthanasia turned out not to be a very popular term. It was something you did to your dogs, not to your parents. And so they renamed it the Society for the Right to Die. And at the same time, the first American hospice came into being for caring for dying in New Haven, Connecticut. And hospice, of course, has been an enormous influence on the dying process, but one that is expanding exponentially in our decade. And it's in fact been interesting that hospice is often cited as the alternative to physician aid in dying. Well, if you have proper pain care and good support and you're in hospice, you don't need the right to a compassionate choice. But in fact, in Oregon, where they have the best hospice care in the United States, people are allowed to exercise their choice, to exercise the law in hospice. Hospice helps them to get through that process. So hospice per se, the hospice movement is not against this choice. In 1978, a play came out called Whose Life Is It Anyway? About a young man who became quadriplegic and raised many difficult questions. And you will hear a little bit about the opposition to this choice from people in the quote-unquote disability community. I think, as Sue said this morning, I never had a clear vision of what the disabled were until I was in a wheelchair and realized that I was very fortunate to live in the United States where they had the Americans with Disabilities Act, and very fortunate to visit Vancouver, where you have some of the best curb cuts I've ever seen. My life is very practical about things like how bumpy the sidewalk is, how steep the hill is, and whether or not the curb cuts are too angled. I'll tell you that the worst place in the United States for curb cuts, I know you're keen to know this, is Washington, D.C. It's a different angle at every street corner, and there's usually a divot at the bottom of it. Anyway, that's an aside. The other thing that happened in 1978 is Jean's Way was published in England by Derek Humphrey, who described how he had helped his terminally ill wife to die. Jean's Way became somewhat the Bible of the American modern movement in terms of right to die. In 1979, an artist dying of cancer committed suicide on TV. He had it filmed, and it was later broadcast on public television and reported by the New York Times. All of these things are not things we hear about. They were part of the popular culture, but they never made a splash like they're making today. Dear Abby, in fact, published a letter from a reader and got 30,000 advanced care directive requests. The same thing, I will tell you, happened to us recently around the Terry Schiavo matter. The Hemlock Society of the United States was founded in Santa Monica, California by Derek Humphrey. And a woman named Sally O'Connor became the first member. I met Sally at our meeting in San Diego a few years back, and Sally has a very interesting history, and I'll tell you about this only because the kind of people who we end up working with are really much more interesting than I am. This was a woman whose husband had been the ringmaster for Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus, and she had worked in their public relations department promoting their circus tours. She went to the meeting where Derek Humphrey was announcing that he was founding the Hemlock Society, and before he went up to answer questions, she looked at him and she said, "Do you have any members?" And he said, "No, don't have any members." She said, "Well, they're going to ask you that." She gave him $10 and said, "Here, you have members now." And in fact, the question came up of, is this an organization that has members? And he said, "Yes, we are a membership organization, and I have members." So that was how Sally became the first member of the Hemlock Society, and she repeatedly tells us the story whenever she gets a chance. And Hemlock's goal was to advocate legal change and to distribute information on how to die. And the membership of Hemlock goes up and down. It was about 50,000 in 1990, but we have this problem called attrition. It's related to aging and dying, and so our membership kind of waxes and wanes as a function of that statistic. The Right to Die societies were formed in the same year in Germany and here in Canada, and the World Federation of Right to Die societies was formed in Oxford, England, all in 1980, and it comprised 27 groups from 18 nations. And in 1985, Betty Rowland, the television reporter rather, who some of you may have seen on television a few years back, published Last Wish, an account of how she helped her mother to die after losing a battle with breast cancer. It became a bestseller, and Betty is in fact on the advisory board of Compassion and Choices, because she had been on the advisory board of Compassion and Dying for many years. A National Gallup poll found that 75% of Americans approve of living wills, in other words, the right to refuse treatment, and the statistic now is the same. Then Derek Humphrey published Final Exit, which some of you may have or have not. Really, it's been revised. There's been a new edition. It's a how-to book on self-deliverance. Within 18 months, it sold 500,000 copies and was on bestseller lists all over the United States. So there was interest in this topic, even 15 years ago. It was translated into 12 languages, and sales have exceeded over 1 million copies. There were some mergers that were going on, and they still go on in the various organizations in the Right to Die movement. And Choice in Dying merged with the Society for the Right to Die. Again, they promoted living wills. Compassion in Dying, as I said before, was founded in Washington. They were there to help people have information about how to die without suffering and with personal assistance. And they really started something that has become foremost in countries where there is no law. Of course, in the Netherlands, this is not an issue because your physician will come to your house and help you to die. But in this country and in the United States, it is illegal to assist a suicide, and you'll hear more about that when we discuss in this evening at the program about the Evelyn Martins case. Assistance can be very closely defined. We did a study of the laws and statutes in the 50 states in the United States, and there are 14 at least where it's actually illegal to do what we're doing today. If I were to speak in Louisiana about suicide and say that people had a choice to commit it, I would be aiding and abetting an unlawful act, which is to assist someone in a suicide. So even just talking about it. And it turns out you think, well, wait a minute now. There's the right to free speech. Sorry, you don't have the right to free speech if your free speech is inciting a crime. So, in fact, some of our chapters in the United States are in violation of the law as we speak. Their presidents and volunteers could be arrested if some overzealous prosecutor in some southern state, I like the South, but I don't want to live there, decides to prosecute us. From then we had the other thing that is, of course, brought the world's attention to this issue, and that is our friend Dr. Jack. Dr. Jack began helping people to die. And by 1999, when he was arrested and sentenced to 25 years because he filmed the death of Thomas Uke, which appeared on CBS, Kevorkian had assisted 120 Americans to hasten their death. By the way, that's nothing. The director of our Caring Friends program, Dr. Dick McDonald, who was himself, in fact, a Canadian, and all the good things come from Canada, what can I tell you? Dick was, in fact, a lieutenant colonel and chief medical officer of the Canadian Army. And he retired to the United States and became involved with the then Hemlock Society, and became the medical director of Caring Friends. And he assisted for over a decade. He's assisted at somewhere between 15 and 25 deaths a year. He hasn't helped the people to die. He hasn't injected them. He hasn't done anything to cause their death, but he's been present as a witness and to provide support and information to the family. So Jack, you don't even have first base compared to Dick McDonald. So we formed Caring Friends, as I said, and Dr. McDonald became the medical director. And at the same time, I found some Canadian history. The Canadian AIDS Society adopted a position statement in favor of assisting a suicide and voluntary euthanasia both. And in 2000, we had the World Euthanasia Conference in Boston, and this brought to the fore the disability opposition to assisted dying. The organization that's most vocal about it is an organization called Not Dead Yet. For any of you who are Monty Python fans, in the movie Monty Python and the Holy Grail, they're going around collecting bodies and throwing them onto the cart, and he picks up Feldman and throws him on the cart, and he says, "Hey, I'm not dead yet." So they decided that that would be their choice of name, their moniker. And we invited them to come in and debate the issue of how the disability community would be affected by the right to die if it were a law in North America. And Diane Coleman, who I've now debated several times, and who is this very petite woman who has cerebral palsy. And very unfortunately, no matter what I do, I look like a monster parked beside her in my wheelchair. She nonetheless makes the point, and very clearly, that the disability population is vulnerable. They're vulnerable to health care. They're vulnerable to the whims of family and friends. They're a vulnerable segment of the population, just like the elderly have become in many ways, or can be in many circumstances, a vulnerable segment of the population. But Diane takes that vulnerability and argues then that if there is a law that allows people to kill themselves, that the disabled will be encouraged to do that, that they'll just, line up the wheelchairs at the door to the oven like Auschwitz. In fact, that's not been the case in Oregon. There is no evidence whatsoever that people who are quote unquote disabled have been encouraged to take their lives or seek prescriptions to end their lives. And the majority of people in Oregon who have used the law are people who are dying of cancer, who are facing an end from cancer. The closest population that you might consider disabled would be patients with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Lou Gehrig's disease, which is a progressive paralysis of all of your motor system. And some of them also have requested it, but they're not people with lifelong disabilities. Then, of course, now we get to 2004 and The Sea Inside, a movie from Spain, and Million Dollar Baby bring the issue of disability and assisted dying to the silver screen. And Clint even won an Oscar for it. Of course, he can't put a ramp on his hotel in California. It's a long-standing argument between the disability community and Clint Eastwood. He chose not to modify the hotel he owns on the California coast. The Hemlock Society also, as we've said, we changed our name to End of Life Choices, and then we became Compassion and Choices when we merged with Compassion and Dying. Because some of the members of our organization, some of the members of our board, in fact, did not like the definition of having to choose to help people who are terminally ill, they formed a group called Final Exit Network. So just at the same time that we're merging groups, they're splintering groups. But they decided that they wanted to be able to help anyone who was hopelessly ill. And whether that hopeless means depression or paralysis or what it may happen to be, they're willing to respect those people's wishes. That's their choice. But I want to change the law, so I can't do that. Because when I go in to answer questions, as I have, in front of members of the House of Representatives in Vermont, as we're answering questions now in California, where there's a bill in play, we have to be able to say that we respect certain boundaries. We're not wide open about it. It also became an issue because I was interviewed on CNN because teenagers were using quote-unquote suicide websites. It's not something that I go looking for, but apparently there are suicide websites on the internet where young people go to find out how to kill each other or kill themselves. And they were, in fact, referring to the Hemlock website because there's some discussion there of the helium method of self-deliverance. And coming in the future, in Toronto, Canada, will be the 20th World Euthanasia Conference, where there will be representatives from 30 or 40 countries discussing this issue. Now let's just run through the legal highlights because they've really played much more important a role. The first living will was written in 1967. Doctors at the Harvard Medical School in 1968 decided that you could be dead even if your heart was still beating. And the notion of brain death is now one that is widely accepted. And of course, it's a definition that has changed the playing field. As we were saying before, the miracle of modern medicine has given us living graves. And people who are brain dead are in a living grave. I'm only grateful I didn't end up in one. In 1970, the American Euthanasia Society in New York distributed 60,000 living wills. The American Hospital Association created the Patient Bill of Rights. And the case that many of you probably heard of, Karen Ann Quinlan, the New Jersey Supreme Court allowed her parents to disconnect the respirator that was supposedly keeping her alive. They disconnected the respirator and she continued living for another 8 years. However, the case, in terms of the legal influences on the right to die, became a legal benchmark, that people had the right to withdraw life-sustaining treatment. It's something that I know we all take for granted. We believe that if we go to see the doctor and we say, no, doctor, I don't want to have that treatment, the suffering and the complications and the side effects are not worth it to me. I'm ready to end, I'm ready to face whatever's coming. That was illegal back then, 30 years ago. In 1983, Elizabeth Bouvier, who was a quadriplegic born with cerebral palsy, so it was someone who could essentially do nothing for herself, was in a California hospital where she was being force-fed. And she wanted to be allowed to die, and she wanted them to withhold nutrition and fluids while receiving comfort, being kept comfortable. That's what we call now terminal sedation. And it's an alternative that many physicians and the medical societies will accept. Instead of hastening, quote-unquote, a death, they will allow you to be placed in terminal sedation because terminal sedation has them do no wrong. But you have to be able to have the right to ask for that state. She lost and filed an appeal, and interestingly, for any of those of you who are familiar with end-of-life choices in Hemlock, a woman named Faye Gersh, who was for many years the voice of Hemlock and the president of our association, who also happened to be a psychologist, she happened to examine Elizabeth Bouvier for her mental competency when she was deciding to withhold fluids and nutrition. And through that, Faye became involved with the Right to Die Network. In 1986, Bouvier was granted the right, but she declined to take advantage of the permission. And she remains alive to this day. And it makes, I think, the point for all of us that what we're talking about is a choice. And because Elizabeth was not terminally ill, she was not someone that we would necessarily have chosen to help at this point in time. And she's the perfect example of someone who changed their mind. If, on the other hand, her disease progresses, she may choose to take advantage of the choice that she won so hard for all of the country, because she was the first case in the United States where it was offered to withhold nutrition and let someone die. In 1990, a very well-known case, Cruzan came to the Supreme Court of the United States. SCOTUS, by the way, which sounds a little like scrotum, is really not. SCOTUS is the abbreviation. I just learned it this week, so I'm very keen on using it. You'll see it all the time. SCOTUS, the Supreme Court of the United States, made its first aid in dying ruling. The decision recognized that competent adults have a constitutionally protected liberty interest that includes a right to refuse medical treatment, but that this interest does not extend to patients in a vegetative state unless there is a clear and convincing evidence that was their wish. Cruzan was someone who was injured, made comatose, and her parents were arguing that treatment should be withheld. Of course, we just had a recent case of it too. We'll talk about Shivo in a second. In 1993, we had a very similar case to one that we had in the United States. about 10 years later, Rodriguez versus British Columbia, where a woman with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis petitioned the court for the right to be aided in dying. She wasn't ready to die yet, but she knew that her disease was progressing, and when the time came, she did not want to have to suffer through going on a respirator and essentially choking on her own fluids, which is the way people with ALS usually die. She argued that the current law in Canada was unconstitutional. The BC Supreme Court told her that she didn't know anything about what was constitutional. They disagreed and they refused to hear the case. And it was argued, I think, beyond that to the Canadian Supreme Court as well. But it was very similar to another case that we'll come to in a second. In 1994, Compassion in Dying versus Washington was filed as a legal case. A district court found that Washington's state law outlawing assisted suicide, because many of the states in the United States have a law that says you cannot assist someone to die, that it violated the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. The court does not believe that a distinction can be drawn between refusing life-sustaining medical treatment and physician-assisted suicide by an uncoerced, mentally competent, terminally ill adult. You hear again the political watchwords that we have to use if we're going to change the law. Mentally competent, terminally ill. That's the take-home message for today's talk, by the way. You're all mentally competent. We hope none of you are terminally ill. In New York State, a similar suit was filed against the New York law, and that was called Quill. And Quill also lost, and there was an appeal filed. In the case in Washington State was overturned by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and the anti-suicide law was allowed. The case was then appealed to the court en banc. That's good French. You all know what en banc means. But what it means in this setting is that most Court of Appeals cases go to 3 judges, 3 or 4 judges, maybe 5, who look at the case and decide it for the court. If you don't like that decision, you can say, wait a minute, I want the whole court to hear this case. So then the case is represented to all 11 judges. This was one case where that worked. The 11 judges thought the 5 judges who heard it first got it wrong. So they reversed the decision and said that the Washington law was unconstitutional. A liberty interest exists in the choice of how and when one dies. I like that language. And that the provision of the Washington statute banning assisted suicide as applied to competent, terminally ill adults who wish to hasten their deaths by obtaining medication prescribed by their doctors violates the Due Process Clause. The ruling would have affected 9 Western states, but it was stayed and stopped on appeal. And at the same time, oral arguments were being heard in the Quill case in New York. So as you can see, in the mid-1990s, there was a lot going on in the courts about this issue. And in 1996, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals reversed Quill, ruling that the New York statutes criminalizing assisted suicide violate the Equal Protection Clause, because to the extent that they prohibit a physician from prescribing medications to be self-administered by a, quote, we all know the phrase now, mentally competent, terminally ill person, in the final stages of his terminal illness, they are not rationally related to any legitimate state interest. The ruling would have affected the law in New York, Vermont, and Connecticut. But again, enforcement was stayed pending an appeal to the Supreme Court. And then the Supreme Court announced that it would review both cases, and the arguments were heard in 1997. On June 26th, the Supreme Court reversed the decision of the Ninth and Second Circuit Courts. This is a very active legal issue in the United States, upholding as constitutional state statutes barring assisted suicide. And it wasn't because they believed assisted suicide was wrong, it's because they believed it was a states' rights issue. The United States has this big interest in liberty in the individual states, just as you do in Canada with the provinces. The provinces are supposed to have autonomy and to be able to make their own laws and give choices. But the court validated something called double effect, and they acknowledged The death hastened by increased palliative measures, increased medication, care, does not constitute prohibited conduct so long as the intent is the relief of pain and suffering. Now, this is one of the most important approaches that we now have in the whole right to die movement, and that is this issue of double effect. And the way it's being used in some states, and for example in Colorado, where the setting is not one where you could approach a aid in dying bill, but it's what we call providing safe harbor for physicians. In other words, if you pass laws or statutes that say doctors can treat pain as aggressively as they feel is necessary to keep a person who is in great pain and dying comfortable, we will not charge them or hold them responsible if the effect of that medication is that it also happens to hasten their death or take their life. So this concept of safe harbor and double effect is one that's very important for the physicians. The question is, and we'll come to it at the very end of what I'm going to say this morning, maybe it's one that needs to apply to the individual citizens as well too. Maybe we as citizens should have a safe harbor to decide how much medication we want to take on a given day. The majority of opinion of the Supreme Court ended by stating that throughout the nation, Americans are engaged in an earnest and profound debate about the morality, legality, and practicality of physician-assisted suicide. Our holding permits this debate to continue as it should in a democratic society. In other words, it's a matter of states' rights. Then came 2001, when our United States Attorney General, a fellow named John Ashcroft, and I've heard various ways of saying his name that include something like Ashcan, I think. John Ashcroft invoked the Controlled Substances Act to undermine the Oregon law that had been passed in 1994 but was enacted not until 1997. Basically what the Attorney General did was that he said, if you prescribe a lethal dose of medication, you are not prescribing medications for a medical purpose. That violates the Controlled Substances Act. Controlled substances was a way of keeping drugs out of the hands of people on the street or by trying to prevent abuse of drugs. So what he said was that if you give lethal prescriptions, that's not for a valid medical purpose. And he filed suit. Needless to say, the district court in Oregon thought there wasn't a chance that they were going to let him do that. But because it extended federal police powers to the practice of medicine in the states, which was traditionally a states' right issue. Now, from our position as an organization at Hemlock, the Attorney General had thrown down the gauntlet. He was going to interfere with our choices. So we spent some money. We took out full-page ads in the New York Times, and this one read, Attorney General John Ashcroft just arbitrarily decreed that terminally ill Americans cannot choose physician aid in dying. If his action stands, no hopelessly ill American in any state will be able to get physician help for a dignified death. And physicians in every state may be reluctant to prescribe serious pain relief medication because if their patients die, Ashcroft's drug enforcement agencies may come after them. This is an unwarranted and cruel intrusion into the private lives and personal choices of all Americans. Help us protect end-of-life choice for all hopelessly ill, mentally competent Americans. No one fights harder for the right to a peaceful, dignified death. No one. We did a little self-promotion there. And the next day, in the New York Times, we had another full-page ad. And this was a man in Boston named Nelson Pritchett, very similar to the Sue Rodriguez case, who had amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. And as he says, I'm dying. Either I will decide how I die or someone will decide for me. And again, making the point that the federal government has no business telling people how to die. We then decided we were going to take Mr. Pritchett to Washington, to the National Press Club to hold, we spent all the money, booked the house, And then the date of November 11th came along. 9/11 then, of course, completely changed all the news anyone was interested in the United States. So this campaign basically fell apart. But through 2003 and 4, Ashcroft appealed his case from Oregon to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, wanted them to reverse the finding of the lower court judge. And because 129 dying people had used the law over the last 5 years to obtain legal life-ending prescriptions. Ashcroft lost again. He appealed again for en banc review. It didn't work for him, unfortunately. And in November of 2004, at the very last minute, he filed an appeal with the Supreme Court of the United States. In 2005, the court agreed to hear the case, which is now named Gonzalez versus Oregon. So as you watch the American news, it'll be coming up this fall. The court will hear the case. And briefs are due from interested parties. And many groups, and these are the briefs that I personally am involved with signing on to, include the American Psychological Association, not because the American Psychological Association thinks there's a right for people to die with dignity, but the American Psychological Association thinks we can tell who are mentally competent people. We have the ability to determine who mentally competent adults are, and therefore they should be allowed to have choices. There's also a coalition of mental health professionals, of which I'm a member, that's submitting something. Compassion and Choices, of course, is, and an organization that we're revitalizing called Autonomy, which is the voice of the disability community in favor of this choice. Because one of the other interesting things that comes out in polling is that we find that when polls, as you know, whenever they take a poll from you, they ask you things like what your religion is, what your nationality is, and sometimes they'll ask you whether or not you're disabled. That's called indexing the poll. That indexes the poll so they can divide it up into different groups. So they can see how many Catholics think this, or how many Jews think that, or how many football players think that, or whatever it is they happen to index the poll for. Whenever the polls on end-of-life choice are indexed for disability, the disabled population also is a majority in favor of this right. But Not Dead Yet speaks from a little woman with such a loud voice that the impression in all the political capitals is that the disabled community is against this choice. So some people about 5 or 6 years ago, a fellow named Hugh Gallagher and Drew Batavia, who were instrumental. They're people who were wheelchair users themselves. They were instrumental in designing and passing the Americans with Disabilities Act. They're people, obviously, who believe in choice. They believe that the voice of the disability community on choice should be heard on this issue as well. So Autonomy is going to file a brief. Needless to say, filing briefs in support of the Attorney General are the Catholic Church, the Council of Catholic Bishops, and I'm a Roman Catholic. I went to an all-Jesuit high school, so it's not like I'm anti-Catholic. In fact, one of my teachers now is a theologist at the Vatican, and we have very long discussions about whether or not the Catholic Church has any prohibitions against suicide. And in fact, it turns out they're kind of hard to find in the Bible. It's something that the Catholic Church invented in the early Middle Ages because people decided that if you died, you went to heaven. So why would you want to live as a serf working for a land baron, spending 12 hours a day in the field? So people started to say, hey, look, I'm going to end it now. So the church decided that they better put in a prohibition against suicide. But it wasn't God's law. Anyway. And the other groups, of course, that are in support of the Attorney General are Right to Life groups and Not Dead Yet. And in Canada, to finish the legal picture, the Crown prosecuted Evelyn Martins, a volunteer from the Canadian Right to Die Society, and I don't need to tell any of you here about this case, who was present at the hastened deaths of 2 women in British Columbia. We as an organization at End of Life Choices provided some support to the absolutely remarkable fundraising efforts that were led by the Canadian Right to Die Society. And to Ruth Von Fuchs, who may be in the room, they just, yeah, there you are, Ruth. They just did a wonderful job coming to this volunteer's defense. We felt it was important that we contribute something also because it's the same kind of case as one of our Caring Friends volunteers or one of the clinical services volunteers from Compassion in Dying might face if some, as I said, overzealous prosecutor decided to go to town. And then we come to, of course, what's most recent in the news. In Florida, a case analogous to the Cruzan case many years before focused national attention on the plight of Terri Schiavo. And I'm sure you've all seen more of it on the news than you ever want to hear about again. The Supreme Court repeatedly refused to hear any of the appeals filed by her parents. The tube was removed, and then the brother, interestingly enough, the brother of the President of the United States, had the Florida legislature enact Terri's law, quote unquote, which put the feeding tube back, was found to be unconstitutional. But before the tube could be removed again, his brother, who had a slightly higher position in the United States, decided to get Congress to intervene. So Congress then proceeded to violate the Constitution of the United States and instruct that the Federal Court of Appeals had to review the case. They didn't protect Terri's law, Terri per se, they couldn't go quite that far, but they instructed that the new channel through which this had to be appealed was through the Federal Court of Appeals. So essentially they changed the structure of the American judicial system for one case. Why? Well, I think we all know, because where President Bush's money comes from. But nutrition and hydration were finally stopped in Terri's case, and she died in April of this year. And I won't show it now in the interest of time, but I have some of the media interviews and things that were done with members of our organization in relation to her death. Let's just see if we can get through the legislative highlights now. So these are three influences we've seen: the social effects, the legal cases, and now the legislative issues. Well, the first right to die bill was introduced, as we said, in Ohio. There was one also introduced in Florida in '67. They talked about it, but it didn't pass. There's one that failed in Idaho after that. And in 1976, the California Natural Death Act was passed. This was a statute that gave legal standing to living wills and provided safe harbor to physicians who would not treat an incurable illness at the patient's request. So again, the safe harbor notion was there. 10 more states followed California. So that was a good legislative outcome. Washington State had Initiative 119, which was the first statewide voter referendum on voluntary euthanasia and physician-assisted dying. It was rejected by a vote of 54 to 46%. It's interesting that the numbers are almost identical to what we ended up with in the presidential race. I don't know if the parallels are important there, but anyway. Hemlock of Oregon in the same year introduced the Death with Dignity Act into the Oregon legislature, but it didn't get out of committee. There was a feeling in the early 1990s that you could not pass these kinds of laws through the legislature. It would only be done by referendum. Unfortunately, as you may or may not know, a voter referendum in an American state is an extremely expensive enterprise. You will have to spend at least $10 million just to even get it on the ballot and get it considered reasonably by the people. In 1992, there was a California Death with Dignity Act, appeared on the state ballot as a proposition, and was also defeated. In 1994, the Oregon voters approved Measure 16, their Death with Dignity Act, which again provides the safeguards where the person has to ask for the prescription from their physician in writing. They have to then be a waiting period. If there's any concern about their mood or their mental state, they have to be examined by a psychiatrist. And the vote was 51 to 49% in favor. Again, close call. The Oregon U.S. District Court said, you can't have this law, sorry, we're stopping it. And that ruling was then appealed by the state of Oregon. So the law was in place in 1994, but it didn't get anywhere until 1997, because in 1997, the Oregon House of Representatives voted to return Measure 16 to the voters for repeal with something called Measure 51. The Senate endorsed 51 in the first attempt to overturn the will of the voters in Oregon since 1908. Do we see politicians doing silly things around these laws? I mean, don't they know they're going to die too? When the time comes for them to face their death, they won't be any happier. In November, voters reminded the politicians in Oregon, you didn't get it the first time when we voted 51 to 49. It's 60 to 40 now. Get the message? They then tried to challenge it in court, but that wasn't allowed, and it went into effect in 1997. There was, in 2000, a citizens' ballot initiative in Maine, again to approve the same kind of law. It was defeated by 51 to 49%, even though 2 weeks before the vote, the polling showed that 65% of the people in Maine were in favor of this right. You know, in Maine and Vermont is kind of like Oregon. They're a little on the independent-minded side. It's because they sit near the edge of the ocean, and they always never know if they're going to fall in. It's kind of like Vancouver. But the Catholic Church and opposition forces mounted a tremendous media blitz in Maine in 2000. In the last 2 weeks of the campaign, they spent over $10 million in ads. And the best one was always the one that showed, this is your grandmother. It shows a nice little old lady in a wheelchair talking to her grandchildren. It will cost over $100,000 to keep her in a nursing home when she's dying. Here is a pill. It will only cost 50 cents to kill her. What do you want to do to your grandmother? You can't pass laws with that kind of advertising, I'm afraid. But at the same time, close to the same time, in 2002, the Dutch law allowing voluntary euthanasia and physician-assisted dying took effect in Europe. And Belgium passed a similar law. The same was true also in Switzerland shortly afterwards. And now, interestingly, countries like France and England are involved in very active debates about whether or not they are going to pass laws that allow physician aid in dying. The House of Lords has discussed this a number of times over the past 20 years, and every time it's been defeated. But a group of lords came to Oregon this past summer to study the Oregon law, and they've gone back with the reports of Oregon, which show, in fact, that for all of the people, which accounts like 300 or 400 people who've requested lethal prescriptions over the first 7 years, only half of them have used it. Why? Because they have the comfort of knowing that they can make the choice if their suffering becomes intolerable. What that does is takes away that their suffering is now tolerable. So they live longer, in fact. And they don't make the choice. In 2003, at our national membership meeting in San Diego, as I said, we decided to spend our money on legislative advocacy. And I will tell you that in all of 2.5 years, we've managed to spend over $1 million doing this. So much for all the bequests that people left us. But what has it brought us? And this brings us up to date on what's happening legislatively. Hawaii was the first place where there was current action besides Oregon, because the governor of Hawaii, Benjamin Cayetano, supported the notion of physician aid in dying and said openly he would sign it into law if it passed the House. So lobbyists were hired by Compassion in Dying and by Oregon Death with Dignity. And Hemlock, of course, provided money, but they didn't want our name. There was this other aspect that came with us being an organization named after a poison. Nobody wanted us involved in their political campaigns. They wanted our money because we had the 50,000 members leaving us bequests, but they didn't want our name on the letterhead. So when we changed our name, we said, we want our name in the letterhead. And that's a little insider gossip, you know, what's going on in the Right to Die movement. So the Hawaii House of Representatives passed the Death with Dignity Act modeled on Oregon. The Senate, in fact, approved the law as well. But it turns out under Hawaii law there are 2 votes, one to approve a law and one to enact the law. In between the 2 votes, the opposition mobilized themselves door to door in the districts of some of the senators, and they changed the swing votes, and the law did not pass on enactment by 3 votes. And Governor Cayetano and Blake Oshiro, who was the representative who introduced the bill, came and spoke, in fact, at our national meeting and tried to give us some insight into the kind of politics that we would be facing, or that anyone would be facing trying to undertake legislative change. And I can assure you, you will see the same thing in Canada if you embark on this course. Deals are made at the last minute for the wrong reasons. We tried to reintroduce the bill in 2004, but as many of you may know, Hawaii has, for the first time in 30 or 40 years, a Republican governor. She's a woman, and she has promised that she would veto the bill if it got to her, so the sponsors have withdrawn it. The other place where we've had a great deal of legislative advocacy activity is Vermont, where in 2003 a Death with Dignity Vermont was formed by one of our chapter members, a fellow named Dick Walters, and they found sponsors in the House of Representatives to introduce the bill, and hearings were held. Unfortunately, or fortunately for me, Boston is not far from Montpelier, Vermont. And although I have to tell you, driving to Montpelier, Vermont in February is not good driving through the Vermont mountains when it's snowing. Anyway, regardless, we provided many of the speakers for the hearings, and the bill was tabled, though, by the legislature, and not for any really morally objectionable reason, just because a member of the committee was more interested in getting a bridge built in his township, and he needed a favor from the Speaker of the House, and the Speaker of the House didn't like this bill and didn't want it heard, so if he held the bill in committee, he would get his bridge. That's how life and death decisions are made in state capitals. Sorry, frightening, but that's the way it goes. In 2004, we reintroduced the bill, and the hearings were again held. The Speaker was the same, still opposed it, and he decided he would focus on the disability community as his way of undermining the bill. It never got voted out of the Health Committee, despite promises, and it will be resumed in the next session, because statewide polls in Vermont continue to show that 70% of voters support passage. So we have to say to the politicians, hey, you're not doing the will of your people. And I'm sure the polling statistics would look very much the same in Canada, if not more so. And our local Vermont grassroots group is raising $150,000 to make this happen. One of the things that's happening in Pennsylvania is that an advance of directive registry is being supplied by one of our chapter groups. And this again comes out of the Terry Schiavo case, because after Schiavo's death, we got 40,000 requests for advance directives in the 10 days following her death. So I reiterate my message from the beginning. Any of you who don't have one, it's what you're going to be doing tomorrow morning. In California, which has perhaps been the most exciting development in the legislative arena, a bill was introduced, Assembly Bill 654, and I don't know, you may all have it in the materials that were given to you. It's currently the best form of legislation that we've seen. It involves protections and addresses questions that the disability community had. Was introduced by Representatives Berg and Levine. Compassion and Choices has a paid lobbyist in California, so we are to some extent underwriting this campaign in California. And they very nicely called it the Compassionate Choices Act of 2005. It just recently, literally in this past month, passed the House Judiciary Committee and the Appropriations Committee, and was destined, despite opposition from Not Dead Yet in the church, to go to the assembly floor for a vote. Well, here's what's new as of Friday. Because the sponsors were not guaranteed that they would win on an assembly floor vote, they've decided to do something which is unique to California politics. It's called gut and amend. And while, you know, the niceties of politics were never my strength, I'm becoming, unfortunately, more familiar than I ever wanted to be. Gut and amend is where you take a bill that's already been passed to the Senate by one of the sponsors, and you just change it. So they may have a bill that has to do with nothing in particular, like road work, or could have to do with safety inspections for cars. They will gut the bill and they will put in the wording of the Compassionate Choices Act instead. The Senate will then pass the new bill, which will be now Assembly Bill 520 or something, and then it will go back to the House. And the reason for doing this is because we know that the Senate is very favorable to this bill. The Senate, essentially, we already know, will pass the Compassionate Choices Act. Then the pressure will come back on the House that they then have to ratify it. So that's what's going on with insider politics in California, and we'll know probably by October or November whether or not California will have a Compassionate Choices Act, a right to a compassionate choice. If they do, as you know, in America, it's the Hollywood effect. So goes California, so goes the West Coast, and so goes a great deal of the United States. So, the right to a compassionate choice at life's end, our title for today. Where are we now? Well, we're getting close. There are still some obstacles. Social obstacles. Death was not a dinner conversation until now. Now it is. Mistrust of organized medicine and HMOs. It's one of the things that our opposition uses all the time, because they say, hey, if you're dying and you require all that extra care and hospice, it's going to cost your health insurance company, or here where healthcare is nationalized, it's going to cost the government all this money. If we just let you die off, it doesn't cost us anything. That's not what older people like to hear. In the legal forum, we have a very reactionary United States Attorney General. Mr. Gonzalez is not as bad as Mr. Ashcroft. Mr. Ashcroft, as you know, believes in the rapture and in the end of the world, and that it happens right after Israel gets defeated. And we're very concerned about Mr. Bush's judicial appointments, who he appoints to the courts. And we recently, now you should all know, despite the fact of all the noise he makes, all of Washington, D.C. is in a stalemate and has been for the last 5 years. Because it turns out there's a whole block of people called moderate Republicans who don't believe in Mr. Bush's agenda. And they keep blocking his judicial nominations. There are now over 60 judges that need to be appointed at the level of the Court of Appeals. And we may, in fact, even have a Supreme Court appointment coming up. That will be a deadlock in the United States. And it should be, because as you know, when we elect a president, he changes the landscape for 8, maybe 10 years. When you elect a judge to the Supreme Court, it changes the legal landscape for the next 20 years by the time they make their decisions and they can be appealed and reversed. Legislatively, again, one of our obstacles, biggest obstacles, is the disability community is misrepresented by Not Dead Yet, and we're facing a tremendous amount of religious and right-wing opposition. What things are in our favor as we try to make this choice available? Well, baby boomers are getting older, and they're not used to taking no for an answer. We're also facing the baby boomers' children, because they're the ones who are going to be caring for us as we get older. They're a generation that's been raised on choice. Choice in abortion, choice in voting, choice of what they drive, choice of what information they get on the internet. And suddenly, as they're caring for their aging parents, someone's going to say to them, no, you don't have a choice about this? Excuse me. The Supreme Court of the United States has traditionally favored states' rights, and even though they've taken the Oregon case now, Gonzalez versus Oregon, there's reason to believe that they've taken it because they're going to reinforce their position of telling the government to get out of states' rights. The Supreme Court also has the interesting habit of adopting the mood of the country. So just in this past 2 or 3 years, and I know this because of the other area I work in, the Supreme Court has outlawed the execution of the mentally retarded. This is a fairly important topic in the United States because nearly 50% of the inmates on death row have borderline or mentally retarded intelligence. Stupid people get caught doing bad things more easily than smart people. and they get sentenced to death because they don't have good legal representation. So the Supreme Court has said we can't do that anymore. The other thing is, and they've gone back and forth on this 2 or 3 times, the other thing that the Supreme Court did is that it has now said that you cannot execute a juvenile who committed a first-degree murder before the age of 16. So they realized finally, someone taught them, actually I wish I could say it was me, but it wasn't, it was one of my colleagues in fact, who pointed out to the Supreme Court that the brain does not age until we are in our early 20s. All the wiring we have in there is not connected up properly. Why do you think teenagers are impulsive, don't foresee the consequences of their actions, never take responsibility for things, talk funny, have their own idiosyncratic habits? Because their frontal lobes, the part of the brain that's responsible for judgment and insight, isn't wired in yet. It's not connected. So the Supreme Court has finally recognized that we shouldn't kill people when their brain isn't connected up yet. Legislatively, we have new legislative champions like Berg and Levine in California and some in other states who may follow soon. We're having a much better success building national partnerships. And I'd like to say it's just because we changed our name, which partly is to blame, but it's also because we've hired a very good lobbying firm in Washington, D.C. called the Raymond Group. And Robert Raymond was the former Assistant United States Attorney General under Janet Reno. And Robert has just a habit of knowing everybody. We now have good partnerships with groups such as the National Association of Social Workers, the people who actually do deal with families as they're facing this decision and this choice. And the National Association of Social Workers is preparing to change their policy to endorse end-of-life choice and right to die. And news just this week that came across my email desk, AARP has finally opened the door to us having ads in their magazines. Yeah, I'm about 15 minutes over my time. And finally, we have more grassroots people mounting efforts to pass laws. And as I said, I would finish with the notion maybe that we need to change the law because people are afraid of organized medicine and don't want to put their fate in the hands of physicians. There is an alternative legislative model called the Patients Control and Comfort Act, which essentially says if you ask for it in the terminal phase of your illness, you can be prescribed all the medication you want. The doctor doesn't go and give you a lethal prescription. He just gives you all the medicine you want. It's up to you to decide when you do want to take it all. He gives it to you with the warning that if you take too much, you could hasten your own death. But then it becomes your decision whether or not you're going to do that. In the generation of individual choice and self-determination, this may in fact be the law that physicians accept and that the government will allow to pass. I'll finish with a not-so-grim fairy tale. It takes about 2 minutes. Family went on vacation on Cape Cod. And every morning they went out and they saw all these starfish washed on the sand by the tide. And the starfish were stranded out there, lying in the baking sun, dying agonizingly. So every morning the family got up and they'd go around and find all the starfish who were dying in agony, and they'd toss them back in the ocean. One morning, all the starfish were gone. There didn't seem to be any more to save. The little girl asked her mother, what happened to all the starfish? And her mother said, oh, the tide had turned. Well, there are always going to be a few starfish that'll need saving, but our tide has turned. And we're about to see an ocean of change as regards this choice. So thank you all very much.